You reap what you sow. It means that in the end, everyone faces the consequences of their own actions. And as I'd soon find out, my HOA had planted nothing but greed, and I was about to harvest their downfall. When I first moved to Willow Creek Estates, it felt like paradise. The air was quiet, the lake shimmered under the morning sun, and every house looked like it came out of a dream. I had spent most of my life working my way up. Long nights, endless projects, no vacations. So when I finally bought my lakefront home, I told myself this was it. My reward, my peace. Back then I had no idea that peace was the one thing this place didn't allow. It started small, the way these things always do. Notices in the mailbox. Friendly reminders about lawn height. Mandatory HOA meetings that stretched into arguments about mailbox colors. It was annoying, but I played along. Paid my dues, nodded, smiled. I didn't want trouble. But trouble, as I'd soon learn, didn't care what I wanted. The first real sign came one humid evening when I saw men on boats near the center of the lake. It was odd. No one was supposed to be working on that part. The lake wasn't public. It was private, owned collectively by the homeowners, but there they were, hammering, drilling, unloading massive beams. I called out to them from my dock, "Hey, what's going on out there?" One of them looked up, expression blank, and shouted back, "HOA project, sir. You'll love it when it's done. HOA project?" Nobody had mentioned anything in the last meeting. I tried to call the board president, a woman named Claudia, the kind of person who smiled too wide but whose eyes never matched her mouth. She didn't answer. The next morning, I woke up to a sound I'd never heard before on that lake. Generators. Loud, mechanical, angry. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and froze. Floating just 100 feet from my dock was a massive platform, half-built, covered in wood and steel. A few boats circled it, and in the middle of it all a big sign that said, "Coming soon." Lakeview Grill, a project by Willow Creek HOA. My jaw actually dropped. A restaurant on our lake. I called an emergency HOA meeting that night. Only half the members showed up. The rest, Claudia claimed, were too busy. She sat at the front of the clubhouse table like a queen on her throne. "Claudia, what the hell is that thing?" I demanded. "It's progress," she said simply. "A floating dining experience. Exclusive to residents and guests. It's going to raise property values." "Raise property values? You're building a damn restaurant in the middle of our lake. Who approved this?" "The board," she said, and gave that fake smile. "Majority vote." That's when I realized they'd done it quietly. Behind closed doors, maybe with some palms greased and favors promised. I wasn't the only one angry. Other homeowners started murmuring, but Claudia shut them down. "We're within our rights," she said. "It's in the bylaws. Lake development for community enhancement. Community enhancement. What a joke. That night I couldn't sleep. I watched from my deck as floodlights glared across the water. The smell of diesel filled the air. My once peaceful lake was now a construction site. Weeks passed. The noise didn't stop, even at night. The workers were there day and night, hammering, welding, shouting. Then came the trucks, heavy machinery rumbling through our narrow streets, tearing up the edges of yards. The HOA kept sending out newsletters, all positive spin. Exciting progress on Lakeview Grill. Community gathering spot almost ready. I stopped reading them. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every invoice, every construction permit, or lack thereof, every violation of local noise ordinances. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but something in my gut told me I'd need proof. Then came the real punch to the gut. One Saturday morning, I woke up to shouting. I looked out the window and saw a group of workers dragging equipment onto my dock. I ran out there barefoot. "What are you doing?" "Orders from the HOA," one said, not even looking at me. "We need to use this section for supply storage. This is my property. Talk to the board." I stormed over to Claudia's house. She answered the door in her perfect white blouse like she'd been waiting for me. "I told your guys to get off my dock," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're authorized," she replied. "The lake and adjacent structures are part of the shared environment. It's in the covenants you signed when you moved here. Shared environment doesn't mean you get to hijack my property." She smiled again, that same snake smile. "Then maybe you shouldn't have bought lakefront if you didn't want to contribute to progress." That was the moment something broke in me. From that day on, I wasn't just frustrated. I was watching. I started noticing things. Trucks coming late at night, dropping off barrels. Strange smells in the water. Dead fish floating up near my dock. I called environmental control. They said they'd look into it, but nothing happened. It was like the HOA had people everywhere. A few weeks later, the floating restaurant had become a full structure. 2 levels, glass panels, fancy lights that reflected on the lake like fireflies. Every night it glowed. Every morning the water level seemed lower. I checked my pump system. I checked the inflow pipes that fed the lake from the nearby creek. Everything looked fine. But then one evening as I sat on the deck, I noticed something strange. A soft humming sound near the platform. So I took out my kayak and paddled closer, careful not to be seen. Under the platform I spotted several thick pipes, large industrial ones, extending into the lake bed. They were draining water. My stomach turned cold. The HOA wasn't just building a restaurant. They were rerouting the lake, maybe for filtration, maybe for waste disposal. Either way, it was destroying the ecosystem. When I confronted Claudia the next day, she denied everything. "That's absurd," she said. "Those are just support lines." "Support lines don't hum," I snapped. "Maybe you're hearing things." She patted my shoulder like I was a child. That was her mistake because I wasn't hearing things. I was watching everything. That night I launched a drone, something I'd bought for fun years ago. I sent it over the lake quietly, hovering near the restaurant's underbelly. The camera caught everything. Pipes pumping dark sludge into the water, machinery under the surface, and what looked like a secret drainage system connecting back to a hidden pump house near the HOA maintenance shed. They were using my lake as their waste tank. And the next week, when the restaurant opened, they celebrated like kings. Music, laughter, fireworks, all of it reflected in the black water below. But even from my house I could smell the oil. The lake that once smelled of pine and rain now smelled of diesel and decay. That was the night I decided. If they wanted to turn my lake into a profit machine, I'd turn it into their graveyard. But not literally. I wasn't violent, I was careful, smart. I started reading through county records, old blueprints, hydrological maps. The entire lake was fed by 3 small underground channels and drained through one main outflow pipe near the East Ridge. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now, it was all I could think about. That outflow pipe had a manual control valve and one I could access if I wanted to. For weeks, I pretended to let things go. I smiled at neighbors again. I even complimented Claudia at the next meeting. She seemed smug, like she thought I'd finally given up. Meanwhile, every night I was out there, testing, planning, studying the water levels. Because when I struck, it wouldn't be random. It would be perfect. One night, near midnight, I got a call from my neighbor, Tom. "You awake?" he asked, voice low. "Yeah, why?" "Something's wrong with the fish again. They're all floating near your dock." I went outside, flashlight in hand. The lake was eerily still. Then I saw them. Dozens of fish, dead, their scales glinting under the moonlight. That's when I knew this wasn't just about property or pride anymore. It was about poisoning the very thing that made this place beautiful. And if nobody else would stop them, I sat on the dock until dawn, the weight of the dead fish heavy in my gut. If the HOA's greed had already killed what lived in this water, then whatever I did next had to be carefully measured. I wasn't a vigilante. I wasn't a saboteur for the sake of spectacle. I was a man who loved a lake, and right now the lake was dying. Over the next few days I became a ghost in my own neighborhood, seen but not noticed, involved but always on the edge. People greeted me with the casual politeness reserved for someone who had been through the motions and moved on. Claudia's smile was still in place, but there was a twitch at the corner of her mouth like a smirk that had to be practiced. I let them think I had given up. Let them assume whatever advantage they believed they had. Meanwhile, I did what I had started. I collected evidence. Not in the flashy, dramatic way people imagine when they think of evidence. No secret cameras hidden in bushes. No cinematic confrontations, just paperwork, timestamps, receipts, photos, drone footage, and a series of quiet calls. I worked through the night, editing clips together, time-stamping photos, cross-referencing invoices with the HOA's bank statements I was able to obtain through public records, and a few kindly neighbors who were sick of Claudia's influence. I made copies. I put them in boxes. I sent a sealed packet to a local environmental reporter I'd met at the farmer's market weeks before. Someone who once told me she liked stories where ordinary people exposed corruption. She liked exclusives, but evidence alone rarely makes a corrupt system crumble. Corruption hides in the gaps between facts, a friendly word here, a wink there, and often the only thing that forces daylight into dark corners is pressure. I needed pressure that couldn't be waved away as the grumbling of some disgruntled homeowner, so I applied pressure where it would hurt: finance and reputation. The HOA was a relatively small outfit. Their coffers weren't enormous, but the floating restaurant was a statement project. Flashy contracts, fancy glass, lavish appliances, all tied to a separate entity the board had set up as a project committee. That committee's bank account had signatures I could trace back to more than one board member, and the way the invoices were written suggested subcontractors with ties to political friends. It stank of conflicts of interest. I compiled everything into a tidy dossier and made 2 moves. First, I walked into town hall. I sat with the county planning office and the environmental compliance department, and I laid out the situation in human terms. I used the dead fish as my opening. This is what it looks like when a body of water is mishandled. I let them see the photos, the drone footage, and the invoices. I didn't need to show them the whole stack. A strong few pages and the right contacts were all it took to get their attention. I asked questions the way someone who knew just enough to be dangerous asks questions. Who approved the permit for underwater pumps? Were there environmental impact assessments? Did anyone sign off on redirecting the lake's flow for this private venture? The planners looked at me with a mix of pity and interest. "We'll look into it," the woman said. "If we find irregularities, we'll act." Her voice was bureaucratic but not dismissive, and that was enough for the next step. Second, I gave a copy of everything to the reporter. Her eyes went very wide as she flipped through emails and objected to invoices and settlement drafts. "This could be big," she said, half to herself. She asked for an on-the-record conversation, and I gave it. We sat in a small coffee shop, and I told her the story like a confession, slow, deliberate, full of the little indignities that make a person snap. She promised to hold it until she had corroboration. She didn't want to publish a hit piece. She wanted to expose an abuse of public trust with the kind of solid backup that the paper's lawyers couldn't tear down. That was the public side of the pressure. The private side was the plan I kept to myself, the one that lived inside my head like a living thing. I had found the main outflow pipe at the East Ridge, an old valve that, according to the county maps, controlled the lake's overflow. It sat under a rusting manhole cover on HOA-maintained land. I studied it, not by thinking like a madman, but by thinking like an engineer who respected the fragile balance of nature. There was a legal way to force a review of water management infrastructure, request maintenance inspections, call for county audits, push for temporary environmental protections. I used every legal lever I could find one by one, until the HOA started to feel the heat. They did not like heat. The first sign came a week later when the board called an emergency meeting and Claudia's voice was sharper than before. She accused me of smearing the community and demanded I stop meddling. A few neighbors shuffled in the room and looked at me with curiosity and unease. I kept my composure. I asked to speak. I told them about the dead fish. I showed them pictures on my phone. I watched faces change, from apathy to alarm, as the evidence sank in. A small group of residents, mostly older folks who had lived on that lake for decades, told me they had noticed odd smells, low water, and strange trucks. One woman, Mrs. Ramirez, wept as she spoke about how she raised her kids in those waters and how her granddaughter could no longer learn to swim there. Their stories made the problem no longer mine but ours. That night, word of the meeting spread. The reporter called that same evening. She had corroboration. A contractor who'd been paid in cash and was terrified to speak but willing to confirm irregularities if granted anonymity. County inspectors called 2 days later and scheduled an unannounced inspection of the platform and the drainage infrastructure. What I had started as a shoving match in my head had grown into a civic investigation. Claudia and her circle reacted with venom. They ramped up PR, sending glossy mailers about community, revitalization, hosting a free preview party for stakeholders, and spinning a tale about how the restaurant would benefit everyone. They hired a lawyer who sent polite but ominous letters to the paper and to me, threatening defamation lawsuits if we published anything false or misleading. They tried to make me the story instead of the story. I didn't flinch. The reporter's piece ran with careful wording, but it ran. It used quotes from anonymous contractors, county records, and my drone footage. The headline wasn't sensational. It was methodical. Local HOA under investigation after lake pollution. Questionable contracts. Social media picked it up, amplified by neighbors who were tired of being lectured about progress while the water died. Public opinion turned. People who had been ambivalent suddenly wanted answers. Donations to the HOA's project committee dried up as sponsors withdrew. The county ordered the floating restaurant closed while inspections were carried out. Claudia held her head high in public, but behind closed doors she was frantically making calls. If you think that was the moment for my big act, the draining overnight, you're not wrong. But that night wasn't about violence or drama. It was about delivering a final, unavoidable truth in a way the HOA could no longer manipulate. I'll be honest, part of me wanted to be theatrical. The other part was pragmatic. The floating structure, Lakeview Grill, wasn't an innocent victim. It was the physical symbol of everything they'd done: secrecy, profit, and an utter disregard for the ecology. If the structure stood, the HOA's narrative of progress would stand with it. If it sank into legal limbo, then the house of cards could fall. On the eve of the inspection, I prepared. Not by removing bolts or tampering with hardware, but by lining up witnesses, consolidating evidence, and making sure the county had every reason to enforce its authority. I invited the reporter to the East Ridge access point. I told her where I'd seen the pipes. I made sure there were other residents who could corroborate what I had photographed at night. I did not, under any circumstance, give instructions that would risk human life or animals further. When the inspectors arrived, they brought flashlights and clipboards and the kind of quiet authority that comes with being backed by an institution. They walked the platform, inspected the substructure, and took samples of the water. They opened the manhole near the outflow and peered in. They took measurements I didn't understand. I stood there, arms folded, feeling less like an avenger and more like a man watching the machinery of governance finally do its job. Then something happened that I remember in slow motion. The lead inspector, a weathered man named Carter, asked the maintenance guy who'd been assigned by the HOA to show them the valves and logs. The man fumbled with a clipboard and then admitted there were no logs. He said the valve had been operated informally at times. Carter looked at me, then at the group of residents behind me. He said 3 words I'll never forget. We're shutting it down. What that meant in practice was that the county ordered a halt to all operations. They required the installation be made safe and demanded the HOA present engineering papers before any water handling could resume. They left scaffolding in place and posted notices, but even as officials did their work, the lake still needed to breathe. The pumps under the structure had been running for months, and the water had been lowering by small degrees. There was a band of exposed shoreline that had never existed before. The inspection found contaminated runoff near the platform. The county ordered immediate remediation and, crucially, they ordered the HOA to cease any activity that would further alter water levels until proper environmental safeguards were in place. That night, as people dispersed feeling cautiously triumphant, Claudia cornered me. Her voice was low and brittle. "You'll regret this," she said. "You don't understand what you've started." I looked at her and felt an old anger rise, not toward the woman who'd ruled the HOA like a minor tyrant, but toward the system that let her think she could get away with it. I said nothing. Words are overrated. I could have stopped there. Many people would have. The authorities were involved, the restaurant was closed, and the story was out. But I watched the lake every night, and I saw that despite the orders, the pumps remained in place. Idle this time, but the infrastructure was still intact. The lake still smelled faintly of oil. Fish skeletons still floated in pockets near the platform. Algae still clung to reeds that were now half submerged in places they'd never been before. Justice in the real world is rarely immediate. It is slow and bureaucratic, but it's also the kind of thing that can be worn down by persistence. I had to keep pressing. A week later, county engineers returned with heavy equipment to perform an emergency stabilization of the shoreline and to take repair measures. They told residents the repairs might take 2 to 3 months. They warned that any tampering with the site would be dangerous and illegal. I agreed publicly and moved on with the daily tasks of life. Work, groceries, fixing the squeak in the garage door. I let the process do its thing, but privately I kept my vigil. I spoke with volunteers from a local conservation group, and together, we launched a small campaign to support the lake. Water testing drives, educational meetings, and community cleanups. It was cathartic to actually do something positive, people responded. Little by little, the community that had been gaslit into silence started to find its voice. Then, 4 nights before the official remediation was to begin in earnest, the impossible happened. It started with a tremor-like sound, a low rumble that rolled across the water and set the floating lights to shivering. I was up late documenting algae growth when I felt the house vibrate. Across the lake, lights flickered on the platform. I grabbed my coat and ran to the dock. At first I thought it was just equipment being moved. But as I approached, the water let out an odd pattern of ripples, and then, like the last breath of a great thing, the restaurant shuddered. I saw glass, then a seam, then a long, awful groan as a corner of the platform slumped. People were on the deck above, startled faces framed by the glow of string lights. For a moment I thought someone might fall in. I screamed for them to get off, my voice cracking. There's a peculiar clarity that life grants you in moments of crisis. You see the movement of a person's eyes, the split-second decision to run or to stand still. I remember the man in a suit stepping back, tripping over a chair and landing hard on the wood. No one was injured fatally. A few people scraped knees. One woman twisted her ankle and was helped onto a dock boat. I helped pull 2 men to shore, both coughing and shaken. It was chaos, but it wasn't carnage. Thank God for that. What followed was a slow, surreal collapse. The platform that had once gleamed like a trophy began to list. Then half the structure sagged into the shallows with an enormous, almost comic sound as glass, wood, and expensive fixtures hit shallow mud and water. The lights died in a cascade of darkness. The music stopped mid-chorus, and for the first time in months, the lake was quiet. In the immediate aftermath, there was confusion, shouting, people running, a woman wailing that the place would have to be torn down. Claudia stood on the shore with her hands clenched, her face pale and stunned. I found myself in the crowd watching, my chest a tight, strange mixture of vindication and guilt. I hadn't wanted people hurt. I hadn't wanted anything to fall but their arrogance. And yet, as the platform settled with a final doleful creak, I felt something break inside me too. The knowledge that lines had been crossed. Even if in the name of righting a wrong, the county shut the scene down immediately. They called emergency services, inspectors, and salvage crews. They cordoned off the area and started to make lists of violations. The headline the next morning read something like, "Floating restaurant collapses after alleged irregularities. No fatalities, social media exploded." There were hundreds of messages, some triumphant, some accusatory. Claudia took to interviews, insisting the structure suffered an unforeseen structural failure. Her words were thin and brittle. I read them and felt the cold satisfaction that comes when a thin story finally splits under scrutiny. And then the legal machinery began to spin. The county's investigation found multiple violations: unpermitted drainage modifications, undisclosed contractor payments, and environmental contamination. Those violations were tied directly to the project committee's accounts and to Claudia and 2 other board members who had signed off on the contracts. The contractors who had spoken to the reporter came forward with emails and texts showing they had been pressured to falsify paperwork. Bank records showed transfers. It wasn't poetry. It was paper, the dull, unromantic evidence of wrongdoing. Claudia resigned from the board under mounting pressure. She and the other leading members of the committee faced civil suits from the county and criminal inquiries for environmental negligence and fraud. The HOA as an entity faced a cascade of penalties and was placed under temporary county oversight. The floating restaurant, which had been intended as a jewel for the community, became the focal point of a multi-agency probe. But the most important consequence wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the lake itself. The county ordered a full remediation plan. They removed visible contaminants, dredged pockets of sludge, and planted native vegetation to help restore the shoreline. Volunteers, neighbors who had once bowed to the HOA's pronouncements, came out in droves with gloves and boots. Children planted reeds and the older men repaired docks. People who hadn't spoken at meetings before, who had accepted mailed reassurances, became active participants in healing the place they loved. We began to see small miracles. Tadpoles returned to a shallow bay that had been dead for months. Migratory birds stopped back along the reed beds. Fishers reported catching small bass again. It would take years for full recovery, but the signs were hopeful. Watching the first child wade into the water and splash, laughing, made me realize why I'd been willing to go to such lengths to expose what was happening. This wasn't simply about a property dispute or a point of pride. It was about a shared resource, a community, and the moral obligation we have to protect what cannot speak for itself. As for me, the dust settled in ways I hadn't expected. I was not heralded as a hero. Some neighbors were grateful. Others accused me of being theatrical, of overplaying my part. A few of Claudia's supporters still muttered about ruining the community as though accountability were an offense. The legal battles dragged on. Settlements, fines, and eventually a few criminal charges. The HOA was forced to restructure its governance with state oversight and to adopt transparent financial reporting. I felt a strange ambivalence as the headlines moved on. The collapse had stripped away a kind of illusion in our lives, that polite decorum and carefully printed newsletters could replace real oversight. It taught us that good intentions, when coupled with secrecy, can be dangerous. It taught us that civic mechanisms only work if people pay attention. At night, after the inspectors were gone and the last of the salvage crews pulled away, I would wander the shoreline. I kept seeing the ghost of the platform, like a memory impressed on the water. Sometimes I'd fish, sometimes I'd sit and watch the surface. I never trespassed onto the old foundation. I didn't need to. The lake had its own patience. It would heal in time. People asked me later if I regretted what I'd done. The question always felt a little unfair, as though I had personally toppled an empire rather than helped expose rotten foundations. I answered honestly. I regretted the lightness with which some people had treated the lake, and I regretted that it had taken so much to make anyone listen. But I did not regret insisting the truth come out. One afternoon months later, I was at the farmer's market and ran into Mrs. Ramirez. She hugged me without a word, and we both looked at the lake across town, now with new signage about inspections and a small interpretive center run by the conservation group. We had to fight, she said simply, her voice steady. But we did. Her eyes glistened. Thank you. The legal system did what it could. The HOA paid for much of the remediation under court settlement terms. Claudia accepted a plea for misdemeanor environmental negligence and agreed to a ban from holding public office within the community for a decade. The contractors faced penalties for falsified permits. The project committee's bank account was seized and redirected toward restoration. None of it brought back the exact life of the lake as it once was, but it bought the community a chance. And that was something. In private, I wrestled with what I'd done to deliver that chance. I had not used violence, but I had used pressure and exposure, and the result had been the collapse of a structure and the ruin of a dream for some. Some of those who lost in court still believed they had been right. Some employees who had been simply doing their jobs lost pay when the contractor companies folded. The world is rarely clean. Justice often leaves collateral damage. One night I opened a letter from the county. They had placed a small plaque on the maintenance shed, acknowledging community members who had participated in the restoration. My name was listed among several others. I sat on the dock and read it again, feeling a warm, strange mixture of humility and exhaustion. I had not wanted recognition. What I wanted was quiet water, the hum of frogs, the laugh of children at the shoreline. Maybe the plaque was a superficial thing, but it meant the community wanted to remember that they had fought together, and that the lake had been spared greater damage. Time, as it always does, moved forward. The new HOA board, one elected by a fresher, more involved set of homeowners, enacted rules to prevent the secrecy that had allowed the previous committee to act. There were stricter bidding procedures, public audits, and rotating oversight committees that included residents and independent experts. The lake's management was put under a cooperative body that had real accountability. I stayed involved, but at a distance, volunteering when needed and keeping someone else's eyes on the spreadsheets. People sometimes asked if I ever felt like a vigilante, an instigator, or a vengeful person. The answer was complicated. There had been a streak of revenge in me, I won't lie, a taste of wanting to see arrogance topple, but the core of my actions was less about vengeance than preservation. I wanted the lake to survive. I wanted the future children of Willow Creek to have a place to swim and learn and love. If that meant exposing wrongdoing and ruining reputations built on secrecy, then I accepted the moral cost. The final months of restoration were quiet in their own way. We planted water lilies and cordgrass. The conservation group set up educational programs. The children made a small mural near the community garden depicting the lake in sunnier times. I saw the first school group come down for a lesson on ecology. The teacher pointed to the reeds and the fish and said, "This is what we fought for." Sometimes late at night, I think of the floating restaurant and how ridiculous it had seemed when I first saw it, all glitter and promises. I thought of Claudia's practiced smile and the way power can make small cruelties feel justified. I thought of the dead fish and the smell of diesel. I thought of the way the town had been roused to action by the slow, insidious erosion of something they all took for granted. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not poetic. It's municipal. Pay attention, ask questions, and don't let people hide behind the language of progress when what they mean is profit. Democracies, even the tiny democracies of homeowners associations, require vigilance. They require people to care enough to show up, to look at the paperwork, to cross-check invoices, and to speak up when something smells wrong. It's messy. It's slow. But it works when people insist it does. And selfishly, if I'm honest, there's another lesson I carry with me. Anger is a useful tool when it's disciplined. Left unchecked, it destroys everything, including the heart that holds it. When focused and allied with law, community, and patience, it can nudge systems back toward balance. Don't romanticize the rage. Wield it carefully. The lake never did fully go back to exactly what it had been. Nothing that undergoes that kind of trauma ever truly returns to its original self. But it grew new things. It held new life. Kids learned to fish again. Old couples walked the paths and sat on benches and told stories of before. People talked at meetings and asked hard questions. There was a new, harder kind of peace, and the kind that comes from hard work and hard truths. In the end, the collapse of the floating restaurant was less a single spectacular act and more the unraveling of a whole pattern of behavior. It was the consequence of long-buried actions finally meeting daylight. The lake, the neighbors, and the new governance reminded me that justice in a small town is rarely swift and never pretty. But it can be lasting when people choose it over comfort. Some nights, when the moon is hung low and the water brightens with silver, I sit on my dock and listen. There's the gentle slap of water on the pilings, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of reeds. A kayaker sometimes slices past, smiling in a way that means nothing and everything. I think about all the choices that led to that night, the choices people made to hide, the choices people made to expose, the choice I made to push until the truth could no longer be denied. I don't tell this story to boast. I tell it because someone once told me that silence is consent, and for too long, we were all complicit in being silent. That is a lesson I learned the hard way. That love for a place demands more than admiration. It demands stewardship and, when necessary, the courage to make noise. Sometimes I imagine Claudia, older now and forced to reflect in ways she never had to before. Does she feel ashamed? I suspect she does. People who build empires on convenience rarely sleep well when those empires collapse. I imagine she learned, as we all did, that shortcuts have a cost and that a genuine community is built on transparency, not on the charisma of a single leader. And me? I got my quiet back not by stealing it, but by fighting for it. The fight left marks, and the lake bears the scars, but it also bears hope. When the sun crests the horizon and the water turns from black to gold, I remember why I stayed. I remember the first morning I stood on this dock and felt the solace of water. That solace had been threatened. I helped preserve it. That knowledge is a strange kind of comfort. If you ever find yourself looking at a small bit of the world you love and feeling helpless, don't underestimate the small actions, the emails, the phone calls, the late-night research, the willingness to stand in a room and say, "This is wrong." It's not always glamorous. It rarely is. But sometimes, when enough people do the work, the tide turns. We rebuilt more than a shoreline that year. We rebuilt a sense of belonging and responsibility. The lake learned to breathe again, and the community learned to speak up. That's the part of the story I keep quietly to myself when the lights go down. The part that has nothing to do with collapse and everything to do with repair. So when people ask, in the years after, whether I did the right thing, I try to answer with the simplest truth I can muster. I did what I thought was necessary for the life that mattered more than any building or fancy dinner service. In that choice, I found something I had been missing in life, a piece of meaning, small, stubborn and mercifully alive, and sometimes, late at night, when the water is calm and the world is trimmed down to its essentials, I whisper to the lake, "You're welcome," and the water slips by without reply, doing exactly what it has always done, holding and reflecting the sky, carrying what we give it and forgiving the rest.